Welcome to this session of the 2024 Cloud Exchange. My guest today is Dr. J.G. Hines, the Cloud Solutions Architect at Splunk. Dr. Hines, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Great, nice to meet you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
We're continuing our conversation in the Cloud Exchange around not just cloud, because it's a fun topic to talk about, but really about where agencies are heading with IT modernization. And one thing I just want to start with is, we know agencies have been on this journey for several years. If you go back to Cloud First, it's been over a decade. Cloud Smart's been over 5 years now. There are things that actually slow down sometimes from agencies going to get more applications and workloads to the cloud. What is kind of the big challenge that you still are seeing among agencies as they still want to move towards that cloud adoption?
So I think that one of the biggest challenges, and I get this a lot from my customer discussions, right, in the public sector, is a lot of it has to do with not understanding the architecture that's on-prem. Okay, so many customers, at least the ones I speak to all the time, they know their architecture pretty well. Even the managers that are not very technical, right, they at least conceptually understand the architecture. It's when they start going to the cloud that everything is somewhat abstracted away. Okay, concepts such as serverless, load balancing, auto scaling, those are all terms that are more cloud speaking, right? As opposed to like terms that you find in the on-prem environment. So oftentimes, managers or decision makers that are on-prem traditionally understand their architectures, but when you have to actually translate that and go to the cloud, it's a lot different. And even migrating to the cloud also seems to be somewhat of a discussion point too. Like they need to be somewhat educated as what is lift and shift? Right? What is forklifting? What is re-architecting? What is replatforming? And it's not just going to the cloud in general, right? There's different cloud flavors too. There's infrastructure as a service. There's software as a service, right? Which is a product that I have, right? That I work for, right? And there's also platform as a service, right? And then there's everything as a service, security as a service, firewall as a service, right? So there's all kinds of services, and all that really falls into the abstraction of the cloud, right?
When agencies start to say, okay, we're going to take this application, this workload, and move it, is that the first step to say, okay, well, what does your architecture look like today? What's your, we'll get into architecture, what's your as is, and what's your to be? Is that the discussion that seems to happen more often than not, or not happening enough even?
So I would say that does happen a lot, right? But I would say that the approach in having that discussion needs to be more methodical, right? Oftentimes, the government agencies, in fact, all the government agencies I work with, their expectation is they would like to see a roadmap, okay? So when they want to get to the to-be state, they want to know what is the signposts and roadmaps and milestones to actually get there, right? And so that a lot of it has to do with initially starting out with planning, understanding their data, understanding the systems or legacy systems, and understanding that not everything has to go to the cloud, right? Some systems are what we call snowflake systems. In other words, they've been customized so much that actually getting it from an on-prem environment and into the cloud is going to require a lot more work and discussion. So there's a roadmap just for that as well, depending on the complexity of certain systems.
In many times, because agencies are going to live in the hybrid world, they're going to have some part of the system that will go to the cloud and some maybe stay on premise. We see that with, you mentioned data as an example. A lot of agencies who lifted and shifted very early on now go, okay, wait a minute, we're spending how much on data storage, that cold storage basically, that we don't need, and now we got to pull it back because it's just too expensive. That's also part of the discussion too? I mean, Splunk being a data company, I'm sure it's a key piece to the discussions you have.
Yeah, so let's just be clear, okay? When we're talking about storage, right, we are specifically talking about data, all right? So data is, front and center, okay? That's what we're talking about. Now, if we're going to be talking about total cost of ownership, right, there's on-prem, there's on the cloud. The issues, though, is that when you go on-prem and you're talking about storage, you're maintaining hardware, and you're also maintaining, footprint inside of a data center, and then power, cooling, and everything that goes around actually maintaining it. Plus, hardware itself is, it's physical, right? If your disk goes bad, right, you physically need more disks. The cloud actually, the trade-off though is you pay as you go, and you can actually scale out. That's one of the best abstractions about the cloud, right? But you actually bring up a good point. The government customers that I usually talk to, data and data ingest growth are actually key talking points. Like, what are the data sources? And each data source also actually produces and spews more volume than certain others, right? The thing about data also, oftentimes, I have to explain to a lot of my government customers, right? that not all the data at their disposal is of the same operational value. All right, so some data is very specific to certain domains like security, observability, and then some data is very specific to actually running their missions, right? Their actual business operations has nothing to do with security. It just happens to do with what they do as a business, right? As that government agency does, right? Their missions.
And I imagine there's also some data that's not worth a lot. You talk about operations, you're talking about value of that data. There was a big push, obviously, 5-7 years ago around high value data assets. Well, understanding where your data is. Do you get a sense a lot of the agencies today have their arms around at least their most critical data, and now they're kind of working out? Or is it still fairly mishmash, right? They understand some of it, but not all of it, and they they're missing that. Okay, well, what, like pick on cyber data, you mentioned observability and some of that importance of understanding what's happening on your network. What kind of trends are you seeing?
Jason, I really love that question. Okay, so this actually is a great conversation just to talk about data in general, data management, okay? So when we talk about data management, it's not just, there's actually several pillars that I think that are there, right? One of them is the data itself, like understanding what is that data, right? Do you understand that data? What are the different data sources that come from it? How do you actually use the data? What are the use cases for that data, right? But there's also the value, understanding the value of that data, right? Again, going back to the key point earlier that not all data has the same operational value, right? So it's the technical pieces of securing the data, backing up the data, understanding what the data is, the use cases, right? But then there's also something right on top of that is what you have like policies and at least in the federal civilian world, regulatory compliance, right? Tell me about the data that needs to be retained, right? Are there retention requirements? Is that data subject to some sort of special treatment, right?
FOIA.
Regulatory treatment.
Maybe FOIA.
Yeah, absolutely. So to go back to your question, right, is when it comes to all data, some government agencies I talk to, like there's maybe two in general that I talk about, they are trying to meet something called the OMB M2131 requirement, right? And so that actually specifies the different, what we call event logging tiers, but they're making the mistake of actually ingesting every single thing. And ingesting all data, especially data that maybe doesn't provide operational value, just for the sake of ingesting it, might be something we just sit down and take a look at their data sources, as opposed to finding out like, hey, this data is really good for your mission, right? It's very specific for security, or it's very specific to like maybe a health agency, right? This is like data that needs to be secured, right? So yes, that's a really good question. So that's a data management takeaway.
I think agencies have gotten a new respect for data management. I think they understand how to do it. They're a little better about it. Are there still some big challenges? Is it just the I always call it the 3 V's, right? The velocity, the veracity, and the volume. I imagine those still are big challenges to get your arms around those 3.
Yes, so actually that's a very good question too about that. So let's be clear, right? I would find that the majority of my customers, they're not really lacking data. Okay.
The volume is there.
Yeah, the volume is there. It's definitely there, right? So once you get the data in, I would say that it's not really lacking, but I would say that there is more volume of data than there is maybe insights. Okay. So, and I'm talking about just not just taking in the raw data, right? But you need to enrich the data. Okay. And so what we have basically is we have a lot of third-party integrations, right? With the product I work with, right, which is Splunk, right? So there's third-party integrations, and the integrations typically come from like AWS, Microsoft, all these big major vendors. And it's not just getting the data, but it's also enriching the data so that it actually makes sense to the customer, right? So that actually, hopefully that's at least part of the 3 V's.
I was just going to jump in real quick because I'm glad you brought up the integrations, because we are at the Cloud Exchange, and the cloud makes those integrations more important than ever, because your data is living not necessarily in your data center anymore. Not everything's happening in the data center. The data is actually being probably passed through from, again, you said AWS or Microsoft Azure or whatever cloud you're using, back to a Splunk tool or some other kind of workload, and you have to understand what's happening. Is that something that agencies are trying to take more advantage of understanding, okay, how do we use different tool sets to understand and take more advantage of our data? You hear the data to decision making all the time, but I guess the better question is it really happening?
So I would say that, I would say maybe half the customers that I have actually are evaluating both the different tools that they have to actually monitor, right? Not only their assets and their environment, but also try to understand basically their footprint, right? And let's just be clear, okay? On-prem is not going to really truly go away, hence hybrid, okay? You've got cloud and you've got on-prem. But let's go a step further, okay? And I'm glad you brought this up, okay? So let's just picture it this way with my lack of visual tools here, right? So everything is on-prem, right? Your data is right here, okay? When you're in the cloud, okay, the data is there, right? So basically what's happening is that the monitoring and visibility that was once on-prem is out of path. Now everything is in the cloud. And so essentially you have two disparate environments, okay? You've got your hybrid environment. And so a lot of the government agencies that I work with that are in a hybrid environment are looking at what cloud native tools are actually here on this side on the cloud versus the tools that they've actually adopted and have practiced from the outset, right? That's on-prem. Even if they go BYOL, right? Now they're taking these tools that was once on-prem and then seeing whether or not they can bring that into the cloud environment or just use cloud native monitoring tools, right? Some, the tools that you'd find in say AWS, right? Or Azure.
Or both. They
or
want to
both,
use,
absolutely.
they've bought and invested in tools that's on-prem. Either A, can you make it a software as a service, as you mentioned earlier, or can you just leave them on-prem, but kind of have that integration between the cloud-native tools and those tools? Because I think that's, in many ways, the best of both worlds, in the sense of you've already done the investment, you probably aren't using those tools to 100%. So how do you turn up the value of both sides?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, okay? Because you have two different environments, right? Ideally, what you want to do is you want to take the data in both environments and you want to feed it into a single system, okay? And that's why you actually have some sort of a platform, right? Again, the product I work with, the data goes right in there. Doesn't matter what environment it is. And essentially what's happening is through one single application, right? You're actually seeing what's inside of your cloud environment, your on-prem environment. If you have SaaS environments also, the data that comes into there, that can also be monitored too. So nowadays, when we talk about SaaS, some things that come to mind are like, SSPMs, right? I think it's SaaS Security Posture Management, CSPM, right? Cloud Security Posture Management, right? That all fall under the umbrella of CNAPP, right? That's your Cloud Native Application Protection, right? So that's a great talking point. So that's an excellent question there, Jason.
I'm glad you bring up this single platform. I think something that I hear more agencies and CIOs talking about, how do we get to that single platform? How do we see everything in one place versus, oh, I have this tool. I read a report recently, the swivel chair, right? I move my chair here, I move my chair there, because I have to see the different things. When we talk about, I want to continue because we talked about volume of data and how to deal with it, the single platform. JG, when we have to talk AI, artificial intelligence. There's a connection where the cloud's a wonderful place to start testing out some of these tools, getting prepared, getting your data prepared to use these tools in AI, whether it's just normal AI, whatever that is, or generative AI, whatever that is.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the connection between AI and cloud and what you're starting to see.
Okay, so let's be clear. Let's just level set, right? When we're talking about AI, we're talking about at least really two things, okay? We're talking about data and lots of data, right? And
they're the same two things,
right?
Data and then lots of data.
Lots of data, right? No, the second thing is
all right.
the second thing is
Sorry,
the second thing is the actual mathematical models, right?
Okay.
The mathematical algorithms, right? The models, right? That actually take the data right there, and then from there you come up with trends and patterns, all right? To actually come up with repetitive tasks. So AI is really good in the end to come up with finding like those trends and patterns and actually developing repetitive tasks, right? The things you could do that a human would do, an admin would do, right? Now, I'm bringing that up in the context of cloud because nowadays, right, it's all the data and workloads are going towards the cloud. Again, you're out of path again, so you still need to monitor that. Like, yeah, what was once on-prem is now in the cloud, right? But now there's also these different data sources that are now feeding into the cloud as well. And so a lot of the big use cases that at least the customers I talk to is all about security, right? You used to monitor on-prem, and you used to monitor certain systems in cloud. How do we automate that? Okay. And we're also talking about securing that data too, right? You have to secure the data. In fact, there's no conversation that I've ever had with a customer where security was not a topic at all. Okay, and security could be not just of the data itself, but security of the infrastructure. And then there's data that comes from monitoring that infrastructure. So just data's everywhere. So again, right to the point where agencies aren't really lacking the data. They're just, is there enough insight in that data? right?
And I think that's why there's so much excitement around artificial intelligence, the idea of how to take analytics of that data and then make it happen faster, and then use the people resources, the analysts, to say, okay, this is important, or this red light, this blinking red light here tells me there's a problem.
Yeah.
Let me look more into it. Okay, it's a false positive, or it's not that big of a deal. But there's no way they can process all that data as a human. So I think that's where the excitement is. What when you talk about use cases to monitor, are agencies still in the early stages, would you say, or some are more advanced? What again, I go back to the trends question. What are some of the things you're seeing from? Can we apply AI, and is it working, and how comfortable are they with the results?
Okay, I recently did 2 webinars, right, with 2 federal civilian agencies, and I actually brought up artificial intelligence, and also showcased 2 tools. One of them is a machine learning toolkit, and also DSDL. Now, with the machine learning toolkit, it is actually a free app. It's something where you don't need to be a data scientist by trade. I admit I am not a data scientist also by trade, right? And you can ask specific questions, right? And it helps you with your models. Things that you didn't know mathematically by hand. If you just learned how to actually use the tool, you can develop your own models. Now, to answer your question, like how much maturity do I see in certain agencies? I would say that a lot of the customers that I work with that are just starting to do monitoring or go towards the cloud, I have found that with that pattern, they're starting to get into AI to the point where they're just having discussions, but they really didn't come up with an actual strategy. Like, how does it align with their actual mission, right? Whereas agencies that are, say, mature in how they use Splunk and other tools and SIM tools, right? They have all this data. They understand their data very well. They can find trends. Even if they didn't use a tool, they know the actual data sources, and then knew manually where to go if they wanted to do some investigations on their own. So I have found that that actually comes right at the forefront with machine learning tools to actually help them speed up their time to investigate or do some sort of a review or examination, right? And I do find only those agencies that are actually using a lot of data and using SIM tools the most and observability, that's where I see a lot of the sophistication happening, as opposed to agencies where they're just starting to get started in cloud migration and SIM tools.
I think it's probably a little bit overwhelming. Is there one thing that you've seen work well for those agencies who feel like, oh, we have so much data, and now there's all these tools? Is there something where you would say, we always hear the crawl, walk, run approach?
Yes.
Start small, try a pilot. Are you seeing something that has been working well?
So I would say that you're right. All right, there's a lot of agencies that have a lot of tools, and I get that, right? There's a lot of vendors out there want to get their product out, but at the same time, the trade-off though is that when you have all these different tools, you've got a lot of different. Now there are data sources and they spew data, and so I think what I tell customers is, do you plan on consolidating your tools, right? So you've got maybe 50 tools. Do you need all 50 tools? Or is there an overlap between tools A, B, and C? Do they all do the same thing, right? Maybe the format's different, but it's essentially the same data, right? And that's also where we start talking about data mapping, I think it's called the Common Information Model Mapping, right? That's an app also that we use. And you can have sources from Microsoft, Azure, Google, or different vendors. And what it's essentially doing is, what the SIM does is it actually kind of does mapping, right? And so there's some of that too, but again, that doesn't stop the bleeding or solve the problem as to consolidating on your different tools.
A lot of the tool consolidation that what I've heard is a lot of agencies have bought too many tools and they're only using, this tool I'm using 12%, and this tool I'm using 18%, and this tool I'm using 16%, and not using 80 or 90% of the tool's capabilities. And what I don't know if you've experienced this too, but what I've heard from CIOs is they want vendors maybe to explain to them a little more about what the tool can do and what's the art of the possible. Here's this tool can do 100 things. Let me explain to you the first 20 that we think will matter. Are you having, I'm sure people ask you the same question about Splunk tools too.
They do, and I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so there's one customer that I actually had a call with yesterday, right? They've got data. They've got a lot of data, right? And I would ask them specifically, the data sources that I see are very specific to containers, right? The Kubernetes of the world and OpenShift. But I'd say you have other systems, right? He goes, yeah, but we're just monitoring these things on-prem. And we're just monitoring these in the cloud. But we're really specifically using Splunk for only monitoring containers, right? But then what's happening though is that they've got a lot of security questions, right? Which is no surprise, right? Because they're only using containers, right? They're only monitoring containers, and they're monitoring on-prem in their different cloud environments. So it happens to be siloed environments, right? And the idea is you want to consolidate that into a single pane of glass to get more value. So I would say that it's a matter of learning the value of the data, but also learning the value of the tools, right? Many times customers have actually purchased several products, but they're not using everything about it, even though it was purchased. So I think on my end, I try to educate them and say, these are the different features that we have, but there's also other features of other tools that we can use to get that data into your SIM and do some more monitoring. But yeah, it's a great question, Jason.
You mentioned the integration. I think that's what sometimes folks don't understand. Oh, I can take it from Azure or the cloud native tool in AWS and then feed it into something like Splunk or a different tool. It doesn't have to be like, I must use only this tool to use this type of data. And I think understanding those integrations is really, and that's circling back to the beginning, the benefit of why agencies are in cloud, because there is so much more capabilities there. I want to just touch upon one last thing. The topic that everyone loves to hate is FedRAMP. We know it's a necessity. Folks are supportive of it. I never have had a CIO tell me they hate FedRAMP. But let's talk a little bit about the importance, not just of being in the FedRAMP model, but what does it do for security? What does it do for you give you that confidence as you move more to the cloud?
Okay, and I will say that is a great question, specifically when we're talking about public sector customers. But I have also seen customers where they're not necessarily public sector, but they're interested, right, just understanding the security controls. Okay, so let's be clear, right? When we say FedRAMP, we're specifically talking about SaaS, right? Like the cloud product, the cloud service provider platform, right? When it comes to FedRAMP. Oftentimes, there's a misassociation with, say, other mandates, say like OMBM 2131. Again, that right there, plus Executive Order 14028, has to do with event logging, capabilities to boost cyber investigations, right, before an incident, during and after, okay? That's separate from FedRAMP. And so essentially what's happening is that FedRAMP actually has a set of security controls, and it's following NIST, okay? The NIST Special Publication 800-53 Rev, well, at least Rev 5 or Rev 4, right? It's one of the versions, right? And so I would say that there's an appreciation for FedRAMP if the government agencies understand the security control families that are defined in NIST, okay? And it actually offloads a lot of the burden that they would actually have to maintain in their own environments, right? So if I was a government agencies, and actually there's 2 customers I'm talking to right now about this, like, hey, we're interested in looking at SaaS FedRAMP, but we're maintaining our own security controls, and we have to do this periodically. And they have to have some sort of ATO, or authorization to operate, okay? The value in going towards that is going to a FedRAMP product that's authorized in that FedRAMP marketplace. It actually kind of offloads the burden of security controls, right? But it also gives them the confidence to understand that these controls are actually maintained, right, by that SaaS provider. So yes, great question, Jason.
We've got about a minute left or so, and before I let you go, I just want to come back around to the big conversation. As agencies continue the journey to the cloud, it never started, it never ends. It's always in a continuum. Yeah. What are some things you would say as agencies continue to mature they really should keep in mind? From our conversation today, we've hit a lot of different topics. What's a couple big takeaways you'd want to make sure you highlight?
I think that one of the big takeaways is that not everything has to go to the cloud, right? Understand which systems could go to the cloud, and the ones that can't, you really need to have strong justification for that, right? Are these snowflake systems or not? Is there a roadmap for that? And then speaking of roadmaps, right? Okay, you're going to the cloud, saying it is one thing, getting there is another, right? So make sure you have a very clear roadmap to go to the cloud. And if we're talking about AI and machine learning, yes, that's the hot topic, but I would recommend that government agencies have a very specific set of use cases so they can also kind of like bear in mind that you want to have responsible AI, right? You can't just come up with AI just to have it because it's the cool term these days, right? Specifically is aligned with the government's agency, right? Their mission. But yeah, those are my major takeaways.
All right, very good. I think they're good takeaways. The roadmap, it's always something we got to remember. I think folks can get a little glazed-eyed over, architecture, but until you start getting down that path, and you don't realize how important it is.
Right, of course.
JG, unfortunately, we're out of time for this session of the Cloud Exchange, so let me thank my guests, Dr. JG Hanas is the Cloud Solutions Architect at Splunk. JG, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm Jason Miller, and you're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on the 2024 Cloud Exchange.